You were a budget error from the start, Claire. Belva's laughter cut through the garden like a jagged blade. She flicked the crumpled paper at my face, her eyes dancing with a cruel, polished triumph. An inheritance for a mistake. A $2 chance for a $2 girl. The ticket fluttered into the dirt, and 200 guests went deathly silent. Quade's hand turned to ice in mine. I didn't scream, I just closed my eyes and breathed in, noticing how the atmosphere had suddenly thickened. The air in Savannah during late October carries a specific kind of weight. A mixture of salt from the coast and the cloying, sweet scent of blooming jasmine. At the Harper estate, the sunset cast long, skeletal shadows of weeping willows across the manicured lawn, painting everything in a deceptive shade of gold. I stood at the altar, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the lace of my gown. People often say that true wealth is found in the things money cannot buy, but standing there, I realized that for the people in the front row, wealth was the only language they ever bothered to learn. I looked at Quade, his steady gaze meeting mine, and for a fleeting second, the world went quiet. He wasn't old money. He didn't have a trust fund or a prestigious lineage. He just had a heart that made me feel like I was finally enough. We had planned this day to be a sanctuary of kindness, a simple dream built on mutual respect, far away from the suffocating expectations of the Morrison name. But the silence in the crowd wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, expectant hush of an audience waiting for a tragedy to unfold. I could feel my mother, Belva, watching me from the front row. Her eyes weren't filled with the tears of a proud parent. They were cold, evaluative, and sharp as a razor. Beside her, my older sister Sante adjusted her pearls, her expression one of bored condescension, as if my union was merely a tedious interruption to her social calendar. To them, I wasn't a bride. I was an inconvenience, a loose thread in their tapestry of perfection that needed to be trimmed. The officiant finished the vows, and it was time for the parental blessing. The microphone hummed as Belva stepped forward, her silk dress rustling like a snake in dry grass. She didn't reach for my hand. She didn't offer a smile. She gripped the stand and looked out at the 200 guests, her voice amplified and chillingly clear. Claire has always been a difficult child, she began, the words hitting me like a physical blow. The accident, the mistake we spent 30 years trying to manage. A collective gasp rippled through the garden, but Belva didn't falter. She was performing a public execution of my dignity, and she was enjoying every second of it. She spoke about the burden the family was finally offloading onto a man who didn't know any better. Then came the moment that shattered the last of my illusions. Belva reached into her vintage clutch and pulled out a small, crumpled slip of paper. "Since you've chosen a life of such modest means," she sneered, her eyes locking onto mine with predatory triumph, "I decided to give you an inheritance that matches your market value." With a flick of her wrist, she tossed a $2 lottery ticket at my face. It fluttered through the air, hitting my cheek before landing in the dirt at the hem of my white dress. "Pick it up, Claire," she commanded, her voice dripping with venom. "It's the only GSON you'll ever get from this family. Consider it a lesson in reality." Sante's phone was up in an instant, the lens capturing my humiliation for whatever digital circle she intended to impress. I looked over at my father, Hollis. He stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of passive, chilling indifference. He didn't stop her. He didn't move. His silence was the final nail in the coffin of my filial hope. I realized then that character is truly revealed in how you treat those who can do absolutely nothing for you. My mother hadn't shamed me. She had simply revealed the utter poverty of her own soul. The compression in my chest was so tight I thought I might stop breathing, the weight of their collective scorn pressing down on me until I felt like I might vanish into the Savannah soil. But then, I felt Quade's hand. His grip was firm, grounding me in the present. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the scent of the jasmine clear my head. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I looked directly at Belva, my voice steady despite the chaos screaming inside my mind. A mother's love is supposed to be a shelter, not a storm, I said, the words carrying further than the microphone ever could. But I forgive you, Mother. I forgive you for not knowing how to be either. I saw her flinch, just a tiny bit, the first crack in her polished armor. It's a strange thing, finding your voice in the middle of your own wreckage. I realized that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is absolutely nothing that they expect. Quade moved then. He didn't look at the crowd or the cameras. He stepped forward and stoically retrieved the crumpled ticket from the dirt. He didn't do it out of submission. He did it to remove the trash from the sacred space we had tried to create. He tucked the paper into his pocket without a word, his eyes never leaving mine. We didn't wait for the music. We didn't wait for the applause that would never come. We turned as one and began to walk down the aisle, away from the weeping willows and the whispered judgments. We walked past the rows of people who had watched me be dismantled and said nothing. I felt a sudden, sharp sense of sovereign calm wash over me. I wasn't leaving as a victim. I was leaving as a woman who finally knew exactly where she stood. As we reached the heavy wrought iron gates of the Harper estate, I paused for just a second to look back at the golden cage of my youth. The lights were twinkling and the champagne was flowing, but the rot was visible now. I had been thrown out like a mistake, discarded like a cheap piece of paper. But as Quade opened the car door for me, I realized that I wasn't just walking away from a family. I was walking toward my own truth, leaving the shadows of their expectations behind in the dust. The sunset had faded into a deep, bruised purple, and the road ahead was dark, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the silence. I was the architect of my own peace now. 4 days have passed since the iron gates of the Harper estate closed behind us, but the chill of that sunset still clings to my skin. Our one-bedroom apartment in Savannah feels smaller tonight, the walls pressing in with the weight of everything left unsaid. I stood by the small wicker basket, methodically folding a stack of Quade's work shirts. There is a specific kind of rhythm to chores that keeps the mind from drifting into the abyss. The hardest part about moving forward isn't the physical act of walking, it's the quiet realization of who is no longer coming with you. For 30 years, I tried to fit into a puzzle that was designed to exclude me. Now, the space I once occupied in that grand house is being scrubbed away, like a stain they finally managed to bleach out. The silence was punctured by the sharp, impatient chirp of my phone. A text from my father, Hollis. It was clinical, devoid of a single dear or Claire. Just 6 words. The locks have been changed. Goodbye. Before I could even process the text, the phone vibrated in my hand. A call. I answered, and the line was heavy with the static of his indifference. "You chose your path," he said, his voice as dry as old parchment. "We cannot have your choices staining the family reputation any longer. Do not come back." There was no anger in his tone, which made it worse. It was the sound of a man checking an item off a list. I didn't beg. I didn't let the sob rising in my throat break through. "I hope the silence in that big house brings you the peace you think my presence stole, Dad," I replied. My voice remained steady, a sovereign calm settling over me that surprised even myself. I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted him to know that I understood the price of his quietness. He hung up without another word. The line went dead, and with it, the last flickering hope of a daughter who had spent a lifetime waiting to be seen. Quade appeared in the doorway, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the laundry. He didn't ask what happened. He had heard enough. He walked over and took the shirt from my hands, pulling me into a quiet embrace. "This place might be small, Claire," he whispered against my hair, "but it's a palace because it's built on the truth. Their estate is just a tomb for lies." I leaned into him, breathing in the scent of sawdust and cedar. He was right. Integrity is a mountain that a few lies cannot move, even if the storm outside is screaming. We were starting from zero, but at least the ground beneath our feet was solid. Later that night, the apartment was bathed in the soft, amber glow of a single floor lamp. Quade was clearing off the kitchen table when he found my purse. He reached in and pulled out a crumpled slip of paper, the $2 lottery ticket my mother had flicked at my face like a piece of trash. "We should check it," he said, a weary half-smile touching his lips. "Not for the money, but to officially close the chapter on her insults. Let's see exactly how much her inheritance is worth. I almost told him to throw it away. I didn't want to look at that piece of paper. It was a physical manifestation of my mother's scorn. But something stopped me. Maybe it was a lingering sense of defiance, or perhaps it was just the desire to have the last word in my own mind. I pulled up the Georgia Lottery website on the laptop while Quade smoothed the ticket out on the laminate tabletop. My hands were remarkably still as I looked at the winning numbers for the October draw. I began to read them aloud, my voice a mere whisper in the quiet room. 12, 24, 31. Each number I spoke seemed to echo off the walls. 38, 45. I stopped. My breath hitched in my chest and the air in the room suddenly felt very thin. I looked at the ticket, then back at the screen, then back at the ticket. The numbers were an exact match. Every single one. We hadn't just won a prize. We were looking at the $50 million jackpot. The silence that followed was breathtaking, the kind of silence that usually precedes a cataclysm. The trash in Quade's hand was suddenly worth more than the entire Harper estate and every pearl around Sante's neck. Luck is often described as what happens when preparation meets opportunity, but a miracle is what happens when the world tries to break you and accidentally crowns you instead. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical weight. The very thing intended to mark my lowest point had just elevated me to a position they could never imagine. I didn't scream, I didn't jump. I sat down slowly, my eyes never leaving those numbers. Quade was frozen, his hands still resting on the paper, his knuckles white. I felt a dawning sense of strategic clarity. Money doesn't change a person. It simply unmasks them. It provides the freedom to be exactly who you already are. In that moment, I knew I couldn't tell them. Not yet. I needed to see who Belva, Sante, and Hollis were when they truly believed I had nothing. I needed to know if there was a single shred of humanity left in the people I once called family. Quade, listen to me, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a long way off. This has to be a sacred secret. No one can know, not even your mother. I saw the confusion in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, protective understanding. We needed to move with intelligence. In the state of Georgia, you can protect your privacy through a blind trust, and that was exactly what we would do. We would hire the best legal counsel in Atlanta, far away from the gossip of Savannah. We would build a fortress around our lives, one brick of gold at a time, but we would do it in the shadows. I picked up a pen and a small scrap of paper from the counter. I wrote a single sentence to myself. Forgiveness is a gift I give myself, but boundaries are the gift I give to those who do not deserve my heart. I folded it and tucked it into the safe box alongside the ticket. I wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge is a fire that eventually burns the person holding the torch. I was interested in justice. I was interested in seeing the truth come to light. The $50 million was a shield, a way to ensure that I would never again have to quibble over my own worth in the eyes of predators. I stood by the window, looking out at the dark Savannah streets. The city felt different tonight, as if the very air had shifted its alignment. I was no longer the mistake or the accident they had discarded. I was the architect of a future they weren't invited to. My phone buzzed on the table, a bright, aggressive light in the darkened room. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. Sante. I could almost hear the rhythmic, predatory sweetness in her voice, the sound of a sister who sensed a new way to exploit a wound. She was oblivious to the fact that the girl she had mocked was gone, replaced by a woman who finally understood the true value of silence. The morning sunlight in downtown Savannah felt different today, sharper, less forgiving. I sat at my desk in the small, unassuming logistics office where I had worked for the last 3 years, the rhythmic clacking of keys serving as my camouflage. To the world, I was still the disgraced youngest daughter, barely scraping by after being cast out of the Harper estate. In reality, $50 million sat anchored in a blind trust, a silent fleet waiting for my command. I found myself reflecting on the old saying that blood is thicker than water, but standing where I am, I know it is also much easier to drown in. My family's rejection had been a clean break, or so I had hoped. But greed has a way of turning a goodbye into a tether. My sanctuary was breached at exactly 10 in the morning. I didn't need to look up to know who had walked through the glass doors. The scent of expensive, suffocating lilies always preceded Belva. My mother and Sante stood before my desk, dressed in uncharacteristic shades of muted gray and navy. They looked like they were attending a funeral for a life they hadn't even lost yet. Belva's face was a masterpiece of manufactured fragility, her eyes rimmed with a redness that looked too symmetrical to be genuine. "Claire," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a gale. We didn't know where else to turn. She began a performance that would have won accolades on any stage in Atlanta. She spoke of a sudden, catastrophic diagnosis, terminal renal failure. She claimed her time was short, weaving a narrative of a mother's final wish for reconciliation. Sante stood behind her, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, though I noticed her gaze was fixed firmly on the modest watch on my wrist. Belva leaned over my desk, her hand reaching for mine with a predatory softness. She pleaded for me to undergo compatibility testing for an organ donation. She coughed into her hand, a dry, rehearsed sound, and spoke of family sacrifice, as if it were a debt I had neglected to pay. Despite the scars they had left on my heart, a pang of genuine empathy stirred in my chest. To be kind to the unkind is not a sign of weakness. It is the refusal to let their darkness dictate the color of your own soul. I looked at the woman who had thrown a $2 ticket at my face only weeks ago, and for a moment, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the threat of death had finally unearthed a fragment of the mother I had always searched for. I told them I would look over the medical records they had brought. I told them I needed an hour to process the weight of what they were asking. That's where the mask began to slip. The moment they stepped out to get some air, I took the folder Belva had handed me. My mind, sharpened by weeks of secret meetings with high-stakes attorneys, went to work. I wasn't looking for a miracle. I was looking for a discrepancy. The hospital letterhead was from a facility in northern Georgia, but the formatting was off. The font was a serif where the official logo usually used sans serif. More importantly, there was no formal HIPAA release form, a standard requirement for any legitimate medical transfer in the United States. They had been sloppy, relying on the assumption that the mistake would be too blinded by guilt to notice the details. I watched through the window as they stood on the sidewalk. Sante wasn't crying anymore. Her nervous energy was palpable, her thumbs flying across her phone screen with a desperate intensity. She looked like someone waiting for a countdown to end. I made a discreet call to the hospital listed on the paperwork, using a contact I had established during the lottery trust setup. The doctor mentioned in the reports, a Dr. Aris, didn't exist on their registry. In fact, no such diagnosis had been filed under my mother's name. It wasn't a medical emergency. It was a harvest. The truth hit me with the force of a tidal wave, leaving me breathless in the quiet of my office. They weren't trying to save a life. They were trying to facilitate an illegal, private transplant sale on the black market to clear Sante's catastrophic gambling debts. They had looked at me and seen a collection of parts to be sold to the highest bidder. The most dangerous lies are the ones that use your own goodness as a weapon against you. They had hoped my compassion would be the blindfold that allowed them to lead me to the slaughter. It was a betrayal that went deeper than money. It was a denial of my very humanity. When they returned, the room seemed colder. I didn't explode in rage. I didn't throw the forged papers in their faces. I simply sat back, my hands folded neatly on the desk. "I've thought about it," I said, my voice steady and clear. "And because I care about your health, Mother, I've decided to arrange for a top-tier second opinion. I have a specialist in Atlanta who can see you tomorrow. I'll pay for the entire consultation and the transport." I watched the color drain from Belva's face, replaced not by relief, but by a flickering, frantic panic. Sante's hand froze midair, her handkerchief forgotten. They didn't want a kidney. They wanted a transaction. They needed me to be compliant, not cared for. Claire Morrison was finally realizing that the only way to save people like them is to let them hit the ground. I stood up, my posture tall and unyielding. "A mother should give life, Mother," I said, the words echoing in the sudden silence of the office. "She should not harvest it from her child to pay for another's greed. I think it's best if you leave now." I saw the mask shatter completely then, the frailty disappearing into a sneer of pure, unadulterated hatred. I watched them walk out, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. I didn't feel the victory I expected. I only felt a profound, aching disappointment. I realized that sometimes closure doesn't come from an apology. It comes from the quiet strength of walking away from a bridge that only led to fire. I sat back down, the silence of the room now a protective shield. I thought I had seen the bottom of their desperation, but the darkness was deeper than I had imagined. My computer chimed with a new notification, an anonymous email with a simple subject line. Check the beneficiary. I clicked it and my heart turned to ice. It was a digital copy of a life insurance policy I had never signed, recently updated by Sante. The organ plot was just the beginning. They weren't just waiting for me to be sold, they were calculating the profit of my absence. I stared at the screen, the numbers etched into my mind, knowing that the predators were no longer just at the door. They were in the room. The drive to Atlanta was a blur of gray asphalt and rhythmic windshield wipers, a necessary pilgrimage into the heart of the legal world. I sat in a high-backed leather chair within a private meeting room of a law firm that smelled of old wood and expensive ink. Across from me, my new legal counsel adjusted his glasses, his face a clinical mask of professional concern. I was here because of an email, a digital shadow that had followed me from Savannah, whispering of a betrayal more calculated than I ever dared imagine. The most dangerous people are never the ones who shout their hatred from the rooftops. They are the ones who sit at your dinner table, smiling, while quietly calculating exactly what your life is worth in dollars and cents. Claire, we've verified the records, the attorney began, his voice dropping into that steady, low-register professionals use when delivering a blow. He slid a folder across the mahogany table toward me. Inside was a high-value life insurance policy, underwritten in my name just 2 weeks ago. Under United States insurance regulations, such a move is highly illegal without the explicit, written consent of the insured. Yet, there it was. I turned the page to the beneficiary designation form. The signature at the bottom was a hauntingly perfect imitation of my own. The same slight tilt to the C, the same sharp finish on the E. I stared at the name listed as the primary beneficiary, Sante. Below it, listed as the contingent, was Belva. A profound, stoic realization settled over me, colder than the air conditioning humming in the room. I wasn't being hunted by strangers in the dark. I was being appraised by the very people who were supposed to be my fortress. It is a terrifying thing to realize that the hands that once held you as a child are now holding a pen to sign away your existence for a payout. Yet, even as the ice settled in my chest, I felt a strange flicker of clarity. I refused to let my heart turn to stone, but I finally understood that the garden of my family was filled only with weeds. Forgery on a federal document like an insurance application is a felony, the attorney continued, his eyes meeting mine. In the eyes of the law, Sante and Belva have crossed a line that leads directly to a prison cell. I looked at the policy details again. There was an accidental death rider. It tripled the payout. It wasn't just a bet on my demise. It was a financial incentive for it. In Savannah's high society, reputation is everything. But apparently, my life was worth more to them as an insurance claim than as a daughter. Every remaining thread of emotional attachment I had held toward that house was finally severed. I thought about the philosophy of the South, about the traditions of family and blood that were supposed to be sacred. They had turned those traditions into a transaction. To them, Claire was just a ledger entry waiting to be closed. I leaned back, my posture regal despite the horror of the discovery. I told the lawyer to hold the evidence. We wouldn't file charges yet. I wanted to give them one last silent chance to turn back before I unleashed the full weight of the truth. I wasn't interested in a quick strike. I was interested in a complete and total reclamation of my life. By the time I returned to our small apartment in Savannah, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor. Quade was waiting for me, his face etched with a terror he couldn't hide. He knew where I had gone, and he knew what I had found. I walked over to him and took his hands. They were rough from work, solid and real, a stark contrast to the paper ghosts I had been chasing all day. I felt a surge of kindness for him, a warmth that defied the darkness. "Kindness is not a lack of armor, Quade," I said softly, looking into his eyes. "It is the choice to remain soft in a world that is desperately trying to make you hard." We sat in the dim light of the kitchen, discussing the strategic necessity of remaining invisible. The $50 million was growing in the blind trust, a silent army being recruited in the shadows. To my family, I was still the broke, struggling mistake they could prey upon. They didn't know that my bank account was now a shield they could never penetrate. I decided then that I would never play the victim again. I would move with the precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. I was becoming the architect of a justice that was as cold as it was certain. That night, as the city of Savannah settled into an uneasy sleep, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The caller ID showed Belva's name. I gripped the device, my knuckles white in the dark. I answered, and my mother's voice came through, dripping with a rhythmic, predatory sweetness that made my skin crawl. She spoke of a mandatory family meeting at the Harper estate to discuss a new, dire financial emergency involving Sante. She sounded so worried, so maternal, so utterly false. I knew then that the meeting she was calling wasn't a reunion or an attempt at peace. It was an ambush. The silence that followed Belva's predatory phone call was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a landslide. I sat in our small apartment, watching the dust motes dance in a stray beam of afternoon light, waiting for Quade to come home. When the door finally opened, the sound was wrong. The lock turned with a jagged hesitation that set my teeth on edge. Quade walked in, but he didn't head for the kitchen to drop his keys or ask about my day. He looked ashen, his skin pulled tight over his cheekbones, holding a thick manila envelope as if it were a live explosive. He had been fired. Worse, he had been served with papers for a private investigation into corporate embezzlement, tied to a coastal development project Sante's social circle had pioneered. My heart didn't just break, it hardened into something resembling flint. I looked at the man who had been my only sanctuary, now trembling from a blow he never saw coming. People don't just want to take what you have, they want to destroy the things that make you whole. They had identified Quade as my anchor, the one thing keeping me from drifting back into their orbit of desperation, and they had decided to cut the chain. This wasn't just greed, it was a targeted assassination of a good man's reputation. "They took everything, Claire," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. 20 years of clean books, and they made it look like I was skimming off the top of the foundations. The phone chirped on the laminate counter. A text, then a call. I didn't need to check the ID to know it was Sante. I answered, and her voice flowed through the speaker like liquid rot, draped in a thin veil of mock sympathy. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She mocked our temporary poverty, and suggested that in a town as small as Savannah, a man accused of theft is a man who is already buried. "It's a shame, really," she purred. "But I suppose these things happen to people who forget where they belong. Unless, of course, they have family willing to pull some strings." I looked at Quade, who was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. I felt a surge of protective fury so hot it made my vision blur, but I kept my voice like a calm, frozen lake. I walked over to him, resting my hand on his shoulder. "Integrity is a mountain that a few lies cannot move, Quade," I said, loud enough for the phone to pick up. "The storm might be loud, but the mountain doesn't flinch." I ended the call before Sante could retort. I didn't want her venom in our home. I needed every ounce of my energy to prepare for the counterstrike that was now inevitable. The following afternoon, the predators arrived in person. Belva and Sante didn't knock. They walked in as if they still held the title to my life. They didn't come to apologize. They came with a favor. Belva placed a pre-drafted legal document on the table. A total power of attorney. It would give her complete control over my future earnings, my legal decisions, and any unexpected windfalls they suspected I might be hiding. In exchange, they promised to use their high society connections to make Quade's embezzlement charges vanish into the humid Georgia air. They were holding his freedom as ransom for my legal enslavement. I looked at the document, my mind running through the months of high-stakes legal research I had done in secret. Under U.S. law, A power of attorney granted under duress or through predatory coercion is a violation of the very spirit of the Constitution. They weren't just greedy, they were architects of a modern form of bondage. They believed my love for Quade was a structural weakness they could exploit to patch the holes in their own sinking ship. I felt a profound moment of awakening. I saw them for exactly what they were, not family, but parasites who had run out of hosts. "You have until tomorrow morning to sign," Belva said, her voice dripping with that manufactured maternal concern. "Think of Quade, Claire. Do you really want to see him in a jumpsuit over a few pieces of paper?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, watching the way Sante's eyes darted around our modest living room, looking for something else to steal. I told them I would consider it. I needed them to believe I was cornered, that the mistake was finally ready to be used. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, the mask of the victim fell away. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I picked up the phone and dialed my legal team in Atlanta. It was time to activate the blind trust. I didn't just want a defense lawyer for Quade. I wanted to change the ground they were standing on. I used a fraction of the $50 million to execute a swift, silent acquisition. Through an anonymous shell company, I purchased the outstanding debt and the majority shares of Quade's former construction firm. By midnight, I wasn't just a former employee's wife. I was the primary creditor and the de facto owner of the company that had fired him. The access this gave me was absolute. Within hours, my forensic accountants had found the digital footprints, the forged entries, and the rerouted funds that led directly back to a shell corporation managed by Sante's investors. True power isn't about hitting back with the same blunt tools they use. It's about becoming the person who owns the tools. I secured a top-tier white-collar defense attorney for Quade, instructing them to prepare the evidence for a complete exoneration. I didn't tell him the source of the miracle yet. I just looked him in the eye and promised that the truth was coming for the people who lied. This was the moment I ceased to be their abandoned daughter, becoming the storm they never anticipated. I had been too vulnerable in a world that valued only the sharpness of a diamond. My wealth was no longer just a number. It was a fortress, and I was finally ready to step outside its walls. I spent the rest of the night gazing at the Savannah city lights, feeling the weight of the framed $2 ticket in my hand. It was no longer a symbol of my mother's contempt. It was the key to their downfall. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange, an invitation arrived via courier. It was an embossed card for a charity gala at the Harper estate, hosted by Belva to save the family name and raise funds for their crumbling reputation. I ran my thumb over the raised lettering, a cold, sovereign smile touching my lips. They wanted a performance? I would give them one they would never forget. This gala wouldn't be about saving their name. It would be the stage for my final appearance as the mistake. The night of the charity gala at the Harper estate was thick with the scent of gardenias and the clinking of crystal, a hollow symphony for Savannah's elite. I stepped out of the black town car, the cool evening air catching the hem of my midnight blue silk gown. It was a dress that didn't scream for attention but commanded it, a piece of quiet luxury that felt like a suit of armor. I found myself thinking that elegance is the only beauty that never fades, and true dignity is found in how one carries their own truth. Quade walked beside me, his presence a steady, warm weight, but tonight, I was the one leading the way. We weren't here as guests, we were here as the reckoning. I entered the grand ballroom, and the collective breath of the room seemed to hitch. I wasn't the tattered, humiliated girl from the wedding. I was the official representative of the Evergreen Trust, the anonymous entity that had spent the last month quietly buying up every scrap of debt the Morrison family had accrued. The whispers started instantly, a low hum of curiosity and shock. Sante and Belva stood near the champagne fountain, their faces frozen in masks of practiced poise that shattered the moment our eyes met. To the Savannah crowd, I was a transformed mystery. To my family, I was a ghost that had refused to stay buried. They approached me within minutes, their movements frantic yet trying to appear graceful. Belva reached for my arm, her eyes darting to the pearls at my throat, searching for a weakness. "Claire, darling, we were so worried," she lied, her voice a thin layer of sugar over a bitter pill. Sante stood close behind, her gaze hungry, clearly believing I had somehow stumbled into a fortune or a connection they could still exploit. I greeted them with a gentle, stoic smile, offering no malice. I wasn't there to burn the house down with fire. I was there to show them that the very foundation they stood upon was now under my control. Before the socialites could descend on us, Belva whispered a demand for a private family reconciliation in the estate's library. I followed her, Quade trailing just a few steps behind, the tension in the hallway feeling like a coiled spring. We entered the room filled with the smell of old leather and mahogany. The same room where Hollis had once decided I was too expensive to keep. Belva didn't waste time. She dropped the mask of the doting mother and slammed a document onto the desk. She called it a family reconciliation agreement, but my eyes immediately found the predatory clauses. It was an unconscionable contract, a piece of paper that demanded 10 years of my life as an unpaid financial consultant and legal shadow for the family's business interests. Belva stared at me, her face contorted with a desperate, narcissistic rage. "You owe us, Claire," she hissed. "You've stained our name enough. Sign this and we'll make sure Quade's legal troubles vanish. Refuse, and I'll make sure neither of you ever works in Georgia again." I looked at the paper, a document that violated the very spirit of the 13th Amendment. I felt a profound, aching pity for the woman who had birthed me. The person who tries to enslave another is already a prisoner of their own bottomless greed. Sante stood by the door, blocking the exit with a smug, self-assured smirk. "Mistakes only exist to serve the successes, Claire," she said, her voice dripping with the same condescension she had used at the altar. "It's time you played your part." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my clutch and pulled out a small gold-framed object. I placed it on the mahogany desk between us, right on top of their predatory contract. It was the crumpled $2 lottery ticket from my wedding, preserved like a holy relic. I spoke then, and my voice carried the weight of the $50 million I had spent the last month masterfully positioning. "You told me I was a $2 mistake, Mother," I said, the words cutting through the room's stale air like a blade. "But this mistake just bought your mortgage, Sante's creditors, and the very air you're breathing in this house." I watched the realization hit them, the slow, agonizing drain of color from their faces as they looked at the ticket. I explained that through my blind trust, I was now the primary lien holder of the Harper estate. I wasn't there to sign their contract. I was there to inform them that their old money legacy had officially run out of credit. "The Evergreen Trust isn't an investment firm," I continued, my voice calm and sovereign. "It's me. I am the creditor. I am the owner. And I am done being your resource." The silence that followed was catatonic. Belva reached for the desk to steady herself, her hand shaking so violently it rattled the framed ticket. I delivered my final strike, a truth I had learned in the quiet of my one-bedroom apartment. Wealth isn't about having a full bank account, Mother. It's about not being owned by anyone else. And as of tonight, you no longer own a single piece of me. I turned to leave, Quade opening the door with a firm, protective hand. I didn't look back at the wreckage. I had offered them kindness and forgiveness at the altar, and they had replied with a $2 insult and an insurance trap. I had done my part. I walked toward the grand doors of the ballroom, the framed ticket in my hand, feeling the incredible lightness of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own narrative. I had been a mistake they tried to erase, but I was leaving as the only person in the room who truly knew the value of the truth. Just as I reached the threshold of the gala, Sante's voice broke the music. It was a desperate, jagged scream that sounded like a dying ghost. "I'll tell them!" she shrieked, her face flushed with panic. "I'll tell everyone about the insurance." "You won't get away with this, Claire!" She didn't realize that I had already moved 3 steps ahead. I had invited the legal correspondents from the Savannah Morning News and the local press to the gala, and they were standing right by the champagne fountain, recorders already running. Sante's scream wasn't a threat. It was a confession delivered to the very people she feared most. The air in the Harper Estate ballroom turned frigid, the celebratory music dying a jagged death as the truth finally took center stage. I stood perfectly still, my hands signaling the legal team I had positioned near the audiovisual booth. The large digital screens, which Belva had intended for a vanity slideshow of family legacy, suddenly flickered and changed. Instead of curated memories, the room was flooded with high-resolution images of the forged insurance policy and the falsified medical records from the organ plot. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the Savannah elite, a sound like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across a tomb. Then, the audio began. My mother's voice, crystal clear and chillingly devoid of soul, filled the hall. Every guest heard her and Sante discussing the financial payout of my accidental death, calculating my worth as a collection of parts rather than a daughter. The Morrison family's social mask didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable shards. I stepped forward, my voice calm and low, yet it seemed to pierce through the chaotic whispers. "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes," I said, looking Belva directly in the eyes. "But once the truth arrives, it never leaves." In the corner of the room, local authorities moved with clinical precision, alerted by my attorneys hours ago. Sante began to scream, a frantic, ugly sound as she was approached for questioning regarding insurance fraud and federal forgery. Hollis stood beside the champagne fountain, his shoulders slumped, a broken man finally facing the devastating cost of his cowardly silence. I watched them all, and I felt a profound sense of mourning for a family that never truly existed. Truth is often a painful surgery, but it was the only way to remove the cancer of a legacy built on predators and prey. 3 days later, I stood in the quiet, hollowed sills of the Harper estate for the last time. The bank had already moved to finalize the foreclosure I had orchestrated through the Evergreen Trust. I found Hollis sitting in the library, surrounded by empty shelves. I didn't mock him, and I didn't offer the hug he clearly hoped for. Instead, I placed a legal folder on the mahogany desk. I had established a modest trust for my parents, enough for a small, clean apartment in a quiet town far from the social circles they had poisoned. I would not let them starve, but I would not let them near me. "I am not doing this because you deserve it, Dad," I said, my voice steady as I looked at the man who had let me be discarded. "I am doing this because my character is not defined by how you treated me. It is defined by who I chose to become, despite you." He looked up, tears brimming in his eyes, but I didn't stay to watch them fall. I refused to pay Sante's mounting legal fees, or her gambling debts, letting her face the full, unyielding weight of the American judicial system. To shield someone from the consequences of their own actions is not an act of love. It is a secondary betrayal of their potential to change. I realized as I walked out of that house that the hardest person to forgive isn't the one who hurt you. It's the version of yourself that stayed too long, hoping for a love that wasn't there, and settling for far too little. I left the keys on the hall table and didn't look back. The iron gates were open, and for the first time I wasn't running through them. I was walking out with my head held high, leaving the ghost to haunt a house that no longer had a name. 6 months have passed since that night. I am sitting on the porch of our new home on Tybee Island, watching the Atlantic Ocean stretch out toward the horizon like a promise of infinity. The $50 million is no longer a secret, but we don't use it for yachts or jewelry. It has become a tool for quiet philanthropy, funding clinics for those the system forgot, and building shelters for women who need a fortress. Quade is beside me, his name fully cleared, his smile finally reaching his eyes again. We are building a life defined by the kindness we give, not the pain we survived. Every morning I walk down to the shore and feel the salt air on my face, a reminder that I am alive and I am free. I recently received one final letter from Belva, filled with maternal excuses and a desperate request for emergency funds. I didn't even break the seal. I walked over to the shredder and watched the paper turn into confetti without a single spark of anger in my heart. "You called me a mistake, Mother?" I whispered to the wind. "But I am a $50 million miracle that you will never get to witness again. True wealth isn't found in a bank account or a deed to an estate. It is the sovereign ability to walk away from anyone and anything that threatens your peace." I turned back toward the house where the lights were warm and the laughter was real. I had found my sanctuary, not by winning a game, but by refusing to play it any longer. Have you ever found the strength to walk away from a bridge that only led to fire? Tell me your story. I am listening.